mostly because of the rough draft that's due this weekend. So just a reminder to everyone that it's due Sunday by midnight on Canvas. And there's a few things I need to touch base with everybody. Most of what I've seen, by the way, like a few people in this class have already submitted their rough draft, and I like everything I'm seeing. But based on what other students in the other class are also what they're asking, I want to make sure that everybody's clear on a few things. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can go to the prompt for the class. And a few questions have been coming up in the prompt, right? And they're very good questions. The first is, how many interviews are you supposed to have in your rough draft? Because part of the prompt asks for you to have, sorry, that shows you people have submitted it. Here it is. The prompt asks you to have summaries of the interviews you're going to use in your paper. Right? Well, I notice I don't say how many interviews you need to have. That is completely up to you. Some people, some of you will want to use a lot of interviews, and some of you might not. That just depends on like how you're going to write. You might not even know whether you're going to use all the interviews that you put in your rough draft. The goal of asking you to do that in your rough draft is that as you're writing, it makes it easier if you've already written yourself those comments, those notes on the interviews. That way, when you're writing, you're not having to go back and listen to a bunch of interviews all over again. You already have those summaries. And so when you need a quote from somebody saying something, you know where to go find it. Or you already have the quote written out in your summaries. One of the essential parts of doing research is taking good notes and keeping your notes well organized. I learned this the hard way. Fortunately, I had people guiding me when I was doing my own research for my dissertation, but it's just invaluable. So I'm trying to force you to do that here. So I don't care how many interviews you have, it's however many you feel you need. Right. The other thing that I keep getting questions about is how many pages it should be. Well, once again, there's no requirement anywhere in the prompt about page length for the rough draft. Right. For this rough draft, I wouldn't even sit there and count pages. I'm guessing for most people, it'll be somewhere around 4 pages, but don't feel like, oh my goodness, I wrote more. No, a lot of it depends on like if it's single spaced, double spaced. I'm not sitting down to count pages. What I want to see is what are the things you're writing about? What are you thinking about, right? So for example, for the first one, I've had a few questions about these questions here. When I ask what is the value of the interviews, I'm asking you what is the information we get from these interviews, right? Like, why are we using interviews? Why is this a good source, right? So that answer is up to you. Let's see, I already talked about question number 2. Question number 3, what problem should we consider? That we also talked about in class, about how, we don't know what questions were asked, how the videos are edited. Basically, you're highlighting what problems are there because of the format of these interviews. Right. So I want to see you write that out and think through the fact that while these interviews are a really good source, they also present some problems when we're analyzing them. Right. These 3 questions, by the way, are me forcing you to write things that historians always have to include in their writing. Whenever, like when you read academic work, like a journal article or a monograph written by a historian, you'll notice that especially in the introductions, they'll talk about that. They talk about the nature of the sources, and they talk about what has already been written about their topic. And it's something that is standard and has to be present in every academic work in history, right? So here we're doing a smaller version of that, right? And I'm helping you through it because some of these answers, it's really not you trying to guess what the answer is. It's just about how you word it, how you format it to fit your argument. And then lastly, for the 4th question, I've gotten questions about what do I mean by at least 4 themes? Well, what I mean is what topics, as you're watching the interviews, what are the topics that you're drawing out of the interviews? So these 4 themes, will be interrelated, right? So if they overlap, that's okay. I just want to see that you're pulling out ideas out of the interviews, and these paragraphs that come out of answering your question 4 are going to be hopefully what are going to be things that you can just copy and paste into your final draft, right? Or add things to it. I'm going to be paying a lot of attention to how you answer question 4, because whenever you have something missing, analysis missing, other things missing, I'll point that out to you. That way we can add to it and make it usable for your final draft, right? So the goal is that this is not your final draft of the paper, that it's forcing you just to work through ideas that will be in your final paper. Right. So if it's not complete, if your rough draft is not polished, that's okay, because it's just a rough draft, right? Let's see. Amelia is asking a fantastic question. Do you need a works cited page? No, but I'm going to talk about citation in a second. So let me come back to that, Amelia. Fatima asks, so this draft, we're just going to do the summaries and answering the questions? Yes, exactly. This is the exact same thing you would do if I just gave you the prompt and I asked you to write me a rough draft, right? This is the exact same things I would expect to be in your draft. But by breaking them down in this way, I'm trying to help those of you who haven't written this kind of research paper in a long time or ever. So for those of you, if you're already an experienced writer and you're really comfortable writing in history, then, just make sure that all the elements are there. But this is no different than just me giving you a prompt and telling you to write. I'm just telling you what specific things to put in your paper, right? The goal is that you're not doing it alone, right? That once I read these rough drafts, that I can tell you what needs to be there, not be there for the final draft. Hopefully, the goal is that this makes it easier, right? But yes, hopefully, if you think about it in this format, it helps. If not, then just think about it as a rough draft. Once you are writing your draft, then just make sure all these elements are there, and you're going to be good. So if you wanted, you could just write number 1, write the summaries and then do 1, and then answer in 1 paragraph. Number 2, answer in 3 to 5 paragraphs. That's fine. Or you can leave the numbers out of it, as long as you have the same information. That's all. That's the main goal for the rough draft. Now, citation. Okay, I'm gonna make sure that you all know that when you're submitting this paper, right, you're submitting through Turnitin. Right. Let me show you. When I click here on Student View, it's going to show you an error message. But in the error message, you can see that you're submitting through Canvas and Turnitin. The app is integrated into Canvas, so you don't need a password or a code or anything like that. It's already part of the Canvas website at Cal State LA. Now, for all of you, you should not get an error message. You'll have a window here where you'll be able to upload your file. The only reason this is giving me an error message is because it's giving me the test student, which does not have an email attached to it, right? So if your Canvas profile didn't have an email, you would get this message, right? For all of you, it should not have. It should automatically let you upload. Now, sometimes there are issues with Turnitin. For example, it really hates Safari. So it'll go months with having no issues with Safari, and then all of a sudden I'll get a student telling me that they're getting an error message. And usually the way you fix that error is by switching your browser, right? So for example, on most Apple computers, Safari is the default browser, and Turnitin tends to not like Safari. So it has the browser has the most problems with the Safari. So usually I tell students use Chrome or use Firefox. Those are the browsers that Turnitin tends to work best with. But as a backup, you can always email it to me. If you're emailing me your file, then there's a record of it having been submitted on time, and then we won't have any problem. I'll probably still ask you to go back in and submit it. That way I don't lose track of papers. If I have some of them on Canvas and some of them in my email, it can be hard to keep track of, and I don't want to miss any papers. So I usually will accept the submission on email, but then ask you to still upload it here. But if there's any technology issues, then we'll deal with them, right? Like sometimes, every so often, Canvas is just down. too many people on it at once, something's wrong with their servers or whatever. And if that happens, then we'll just deal with it. But the reason I wanted to highlight the fact that I'm using Turnitin here on Canvas is because I have found that a lot of students don't know what Turnitin is. Turnitin is a plagiarism checking application. So when you upload a paper on Turnitin, it checks it, it does two different kinds of checks. It checks it against all the papers submitted to Turnitin. So for example, if two students submit the exact same paper, Turnitin will highlight your entire paper and it will tell me this is the exact same wording as this other paper submitted to you. And it tells me exactly what student submitted it. So you don't want to do that, right? If like a group of you are working on the paper together, the key is to not copy and paste off each other, right? We can help each other out, ideas, help each other proofread and things like that, but we don't want to use the exact same wording because that is plagiarism. And what happens in negative plagiarism, when that occurs, both people get Fs. Right, it's an F, and then I have to fill out plagiarism paperwork submitted to the school. If you are caught plagiarizing, the most severe consequence is that you can be expelled from the school. So you don't want that, and you don't want that on your record, right? The other thing that Turnitin does is it checks your paper against the internet, essentially any like newspaper articles, blogs, websites that are available. And it tells me if there's any wording that you've used from any online website. So this is the most common thing Turnitin catches, right? I don't have a ton of issues with plagiarism usually, but I want to make sure to dissuade people from doing what is the most common mistake on Turnitin. The most common thing will happen is that it's the weekend. If somebody hasn't worked on their paper at all of a sudden it's panic mode, right? I have this rough draft to submit Sunday by midnight, and how do I make this easier for me? Well, the thing most students will do is Google racism in nursing. And if you Google racism in nursing, there are things that'll come up that might seem relevant, except you're actually doing yourself a huge disservice because the prompt I've made is specific on this website and these interviews, right? And most of the things you're going to find online are not directly talking about those interviews. So you don't really want to use any of this stuff. But I'm like, there's always somebody. Every semester, there's somebody who thinks that they can just come and copy and paste from an online article. Right, so they'll click on something like this and they'll be like, read a few lines, and they'll say, oh, this sounds perfect. They copy it, and then they take it into their paper and they paste. And by the way, most of the time people that get caught doing this kind of plagiarism will do this, like they won't even get rid of the formatting. So all the formatting is still from the original source. But why is this a problem? Why do you not want to just copy and paste from an online article into your paper? You guys tell me.
Because there's an application called Turnitin.
Say that again?
Catch us, yeah. Because there's an application called Turnitin and it's gonna catch us. So
yeah, that's the thing. This is the easiest thing to catch. It's black and white, right? Turnitin will highlight your paper and it'll tell me the website you got it from. Like it goes as far as to tell me what website was copied and pasted from. And it's just black and white, it's plagiarism. You can't say you made a mistake. You can't say you didn't mean to. It's just very obvious.
I think it's a better idea to disable the Turnitin website than copying, you know. I'm just giving the students a hand here.
It's much better to just not do that. But I want to point out that in a history paper, not everything you use is your own words and not everything is your own information, right? Like there's information you're using from the readings, from lecture. You're allowed to do research online if you want to. It was not a requirement, but you could. So let's say you really liked that first sentence in that paper. Yeah, this sentence: across the United States, white citizens are experiencing an awakening, recognizing the systemic racism that bleeds into every fabric of life, from housing and grocery shopping to education and earning an income, affecting Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Well, first of all, you probably don't want to use something like this because your paper's not going to touch on housing. Your paper's not going to talk about grocery shopping. It's going to talk about education, but only about a particular kind of education. But let's say you really loved this sentence and you want to use it in your paper. You could use it in your paper. You would just need to put direct quotes around it and cite it, right? Cite whatever, if you're copying and pasting or if you're using information from any other source, all you want to do is cite it. So you put quotes around it if it's a direct quote. On Word, you go to references and then you insert footnote. Click this for Chicago style. I'm sorry, MLA style is different. In MLA, but I want to show you just Chicago style real quick. In Chicago style, the format puts a little one at the end of the sentence and creates a space at the bottom of the page to include the citation information. So in this case, it would be like last name, first name, the title of the article, the date it was accessed, and then the link. Right, all that information would go there. In MLA style, you put it in parentheses, right? Instead of putting the number at the end of the sentence, you put in parentheses things like the last name and usually a page number, but for a website, there's no page number. And then you've properly cited, like you've attributed. I like to tell a story. A few years ago, I had a student that submitted a paper that showed up on Turnitin. It told me it was entirely plagiarized. Every sentence in the paper was copied and pasted from a couple of different online sources. So I was like, oh no, like it came up as like 100% plagiarized on the system. I clicked on the paper, pulled it up. Turnitin had highlighted every sentence in this paper. And yet the student didn't get in trouble. Why? Because that student cited every single sentence. The entire paper was copied and pasted, but the entire paper was also properly cited. All properly cited. I've never been more amazed in my life. Now, that paper is still a 0, right? Like they didn't follow the assignment, the prompt, right? Because the prompt was not to copy and paste from online. The prompt was to write your own thoughts and ideas. But they didn't get in trouble. There was no plagiarism. They cited everything properly. And I tell that story so that I'm like, citation is a lifesaver. It will save you so many different times. But what often happens if you're sitting down to write something and you're using information from various sources, you might be wondering, when do I cite something and when do I not cite something? There's a couple of rules you want to think about to follow that. If you follow the rules, you will not be in any kind of trouble. Number one rule for me is when you're in doubt, cite. Yes, Jose, for preempting me. Yeah, you can't get in trouble for citing too much, especially in a rough draft. Like in a rough draft, I will go in and I will tell you, you don't need to cite this sentence. You don't need to cite this other one. Then all you have to do is delete the citation. But you can get in trouble for not citing enough, right? So that's why I'm like, when in doubt, you cite. The other thing you could do is, let's say you liked the information in a sentence, right? I'm going to use this one as an example, but it could be anything. You like the information, but you can put it in your own words. So instead of saying like across the United States, in the US, people are realizing that racism is a problem that affects all aspects of life, including nursing. Now, a sentence like this I would tell you to still cite this, even though you put it in your own words. Why? Because you didn't come up with it on your own, right? You're paraphrasing this other sentence that came from an online source. You don't have to put it in quotation marks though, because these are your own words. The information's not, or the idea is just not yours. So what you do is you go into references and you insert the citation and you cite it. What this tells me is that this sentence is not a direct quote. You put it in your own words, but the information or the idea came from the source you're telling. Right? So you cite not just direct quotes, but you also cite any information you're getting from somewhere else. So for example, I expect that every person in this class will probably use something from the PDFs from the medical apartheid book, right? When talking about racism in medicine, you can use all the examples we talked about in class. So if you're going to use an example from the reading, I'm helping you out a little bit here because you don't have the actual books, right? I gave you PDFs. I didn't give you the actual physical books. So if you want to use either readings from either book, I have formatted here in the prompt how you would cite both the medical apartheid book and the other book I'm using, the textbook, A Different Mirror. Right, so the only thing you would need to add in here is like a page number if you're citing a specific example. So I'm hoping that helps you. I think it was fair for me to give you this information since all I gave you was PDFs, you don't have the physical book in front of you. Right, now for a rough draft, typically for a rough draft, not everything needs to be perfectly cited, right? Some of you like to just write, and citing makes you feel like you're slowing down, right? So some of you just leave a blank space to insert a footnote. Well, don't leave it completely blank, but make sure you tell yourself and me that this is something that is coming from a different source. But you don't need to have all the commas and periods exactly correct in a rough draft. For a final draft, you need to have the full citation. But in a rough draft, as long as you are telling me and yourself that that needs to be cited in the final draft, that's good enough. Does that sound fair? The other thing to remember is that you don't need to reinvent wheels, right? A lot of you use particular websites that help you figure out citation, right? I have found that the one that I used as a student, a lot of you still use, EasyBib. EasyBib is a citation generator. So you can go on this website, tell it what you're citing, right? Like if you're citing a website, a book, a journal. And you can tell it also what format you want, whether you want MLA, Chicago style, APA, and it will help you cite it. Like it will generate a works cited or a bibliography page for you, right? Like you can go in here and like it asks you for information, like it'll ask you for the website URL or like the title, the date, all these things, and then it'll create the citation for you. The other one I've seen a lot of you use, I don't know which one's better anymore, but Citation Machine. This one looks like it also works well, like it lets you do APA, MLA, so the usual stuff that most of these do. So actually these look like they're very similar to EasyBib. So whichever thing like that you want to use it. But note that also Word and Google Docs also have those programs that help you figure out how to cite. So if you go into references, right, in one of the headings on Word, this is just in Word. If you go to references and you click insert citation, you can tell it what kind of document you're citing. Like it even has like an interview. And you put in the information that it asks for. and then it generates the citation for you wherever your cursor was left. So it inserted the gibberish that I put in. Google Docs has a similar program in it. So I feel like now you have so much technology to help you with that there's no excuse for not citing. But are there questions about citation?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Professor. What is the purpose of the assignment here, and why nursing? I mean, I think there's racism and like acting. There's racism and teaching. There's racism about so many things in here. Why we have to specifically write about nursing?
Yeah, I did. I actually had other sources. I was trying to decide whether I was gonna use education. There was a bunch of civil rights teachers that were interviewed recently about their experience teaching during the civil rights movement. Because we're doing, I guess, we're reading a lot about the history of medicine. And I found a website that had done these interviews. So a lot of it was out of practicality, so that I didn't have to go out and do a ton of outside research. I wanted to limit it and do this more as kind of learning how to ride a bike with the training wheels on, right? So not a full on choose your own topic, do your own research. I wanted this to be a kind of more controlled kind of research paper. And nursing fit the requirements of everything I was looking for. It fit the theme of the class and the readings we were talking about, and I found these interviews that I thought gave you enough material to work with. So that was my thinking behind it. I wanted you to write something that was meaningful in terms of working with primary sources, working with the theme of medicine and racism, and it just happened to fit all my requirements. But yeah, we could have done this paper about any aspect of medicine, for example, or really any kind of profession. We could have found instances of racism in any profession. I just wanted it to be a bit more controlled in terms of I'm telling you what the topic is instead of making you write your own topic. Some of you can handle it. Some of you can handle coming up with your own topic. But for a lower division class, I thought I wanted to give you the topic myself. Jose asks, would it be possible to see an example of how to cite it in an interview? I was thinking about it, and it would be like a website. It's exactly like a website, Jose. So that's an excellent question. And, nobody has asked me that so far. So I have a lot of like citation memorized on how to cite Chicago style. What I usually use, though, when I'm like, okay, I haven't cited in an interview in a long time, I use the OWL, the Purdue page. As most of the time, I personally don't need ECBib or citation managers to do the citation. I just need the general format. Right. This is the How to Cite Chicago Style website. They have a similar website for MLA, but I just go down to the navigation window, and there's one on how to cite interviews. Right. But here's one of the problems you're going to run into. Most of the time, it's going to show you how to format an unpublished interview. So this is for if you personally interviewed people, this is how you would cite it. So you don't want that first one. Right? You want this one, how to cite a published or broadcast interview, right? So in Chicago style, when you're doing a footnote or an endnote, this is what you want. You want the first name and last name of the person being interviewed. Then you want to say interviewed by so-and-so, the title of the broadcast program, publisher, or date. So let's do one of the interviews from the website, right? I'm just going to go with the first one that's here. So let's say I use a brilliant quote from the interview, right? I put it in period, it's quoted, so I know that this is the direct quote. For citing Chicago style, I'd go up to references and I want to insert a footnote. right? So it puts a number at the end of the sentence, and it creates a space at the bottom for citation. So I need the name of the person being interviewed. So Nikki Opere. I'm just going to go in. Actually, I shouldn't copy and paste, but I'm going to for the purposes of this so I can do it a little bit faster. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to edit, paste. Okay. You wouldn't want it to be in bold, right? So I would come in and change this. But you want the name of the person being interviewed. I would double check and see if we know who's conducting the interviews. And I believe we're never told, because I'm pretty sure that different people conducted these interviews. So because we don't know who conducted the interviews, right? Like the name of a person, you leave that blank, right? So this part of the interview, you leave that blank. Next, you'd want the title of the broadcast program. So that would be the name of the website. I would go back to the website. Let me go back. And it's Reckoning with Racism in Nursing. So I have to put Reckoning with Racism in Nursing, because that's the title of the web page. You want it in italics, right? The name of the organization that conducted these interviews is the same, right? But it says here, produced by Story Center in association with Seedwork Films. So I'm going to give credit to Story Center, right? Because they're the ones that produce this. We're not watching the documentary or any of the other filming stuff. So I'm going to put that. Usually you want to figure out the date in which the interviews were conducted, or that the page was updated. And like if I'm looking at this real quick, I don't see a specific date for the update, because I noticed with the formatting in the last week or so, they updated the web page. So instead, I'm going to put the date in which I checked the website. So I'm going to put 18 October 2022. And then I am going to link to the interview. So there's a couple of options for what link to use here. You can either link like the YouTube page, but I'm going to link the whole page where the video and the information is located at. And I go in here and I paste it, add a period. And I'm going to make this bigger so you can see it. And this is how you would cite the interviews from the website we're using. Would it help if I put this example in the prompt? I'm going through it kind of fast because I'm like, once I know what information to do, I'm like, I do it pretty fast. Okay, I will add, so I will, in the prompt at the end of class, I'm going to go in and I put example of how to cite interviews, and I will put this one that we just did. That way you can just, basically you could copy and paste it, right? And then just change the name of the person and change the date, change the website, like change the stuff you need to change, but you see the format and the information. And I'll like double check all my commas and periods when I post it on the prompt. But that's an excellent question. Any other questions? No, then okay. The other thing I want to make sure and touch on is that you can use the Life Happens class. a lot of you still haven't used your Life Happens clause. In the class, I said that you could, on one assignment, use the Life Happens clause, which automatically gives you 3 extra days on an assignment without any questions asked. Right? So you don't have to give me a reasoning why you need more time or anything. You just have to send me an email, tell me that would you would like to use the Life Happens clause, and you get 3 days. 3 extra days to complete it. On the other hand, if you need more than 3 extra days, right? If there's been a health issue, if you're in the hospital, if there's been something major that has happened, right? Those are legitimate reasons for asking for an extension. And there's no problem in asking for an extension. I think it's fair, and I think everyone in the class would agree that there are situations in which people need more time to submit something. I'd much rather you complete something, get into the assignment done, but there are legitimate reasons why people might need an extension. So if you find yourself in that position, just let me know. And I am flexible on those things. Right. I'm trying to be humane, my approach to like due dates and assignments like that, because one, like a lot of you, or not a lot of you, a number of students are still getting sick with COVID, or family members are getting sick with COVID. And I think there's still a need for flexibility in things like that. But if you can get it done by the deadline, all the better. Some of you have already used your Life Happens clause, and I'm going to make an exception for this rough draft, because I think rough drafts are an essential part of the writing process. They're important. That's how we learn what we're doing right in our writing and what needs improvement, right? So if you already used the Life Happens clause, but you end up needing just a couple of extra more days, just let me know. I will. For this paper, it'll be like starting over. If you need the Life Happens clause, use it. This way, there's also less of an excuse or a need to plagiarize. Right? I'm not interested in reading the thoughts of some journalist online. I'm interested in reading your thoughts, because part of what I'm seeing is how you're interpreting the interviews I assigned and how you're connecting the interviews to the material from the class, right? How you're using that material, if you're using it, right? If it's helping you understand the interviews or not. So I can see that, I will be able to see that in your writing. And it's what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in other people's opinions. So any other questions? Every time I'm like, I love it when you all have questions, because you always come up with really smart questions that usually help the rest of the class. So any other ones? No? Okay, then let's continue. One of the things that we need to get started talking about is the world wars, right? The world wars have a significant impact in the development of race and racism in the United States. They just do. You can't underplay the importance of the world wars in understanding how things change, right? There's a direct connection between World War II and the Civil Rights Movement, right? So we want to explore that. And I love talking about the world wars anyway, and students tend to really like talking about war. So I always ask you why, or are any of you bored with the world wars yet? Because there's still people writing books and documentaries and finding new things to say about World War I and World War II. Why do you think people are so fascinated with the world wars? It's interesting. Is it prior to the military, you loved it? A sense of connection. Yeah, I think particularly World War II makes for a really easy kind of understanding, right? In World War II, there's a really clear bad guys, right? Like the Nazis, bad, Hitler, bad. There's no question, bad. And then it allows us to see things in more black and white terms. even though there is complexity in the way we can analyze the Allies during World War II. World War I, though, tends to be a little bit more complex because you can argue about who the bad guys are in World War I. And it's actually hard to pinpoint and to place blame when looking at, who specifically is caused World War I. There is an immediate trigger cause of the wars, right? There's always short-term causes, things are immediate, and more long-term causes, right? So the short-term cause, the immediate cause of World War I was the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And because of alliances, it brings in most of Western Europe into what could have been a regional Eastern European conflict, right? But because there were alliances with Germany, with Russia, with Britain, it brings in Europe, or Western Europe, parts of Western Europe. However, because those Western European countries had colonies, because they controlled so much of the global territory, this became a global war, right? Because even at a smaller, at a big scale, World War I could have been a Western Europe or a European war. Could have been that, but it was not. It was a war that touched almost every region of the world. And part of why that was the case was because of the empire building that the Western Europeans had engaged in, right? Yeah, Fatima had a great answer in here. I don't want to ignore it. That part of what we're fascinated to is when we learn lessons from history, right? Some of these extreme circumstances caused by war allow us to see kind of the best and the worst of the kind of decision making that humans go through and the choices we make. And also, like, every decision or a lot of decisions were a matter of life and death for people, right? So for World War I, right, this is why we say that alliances, typically when we talk about World War, alliances are a big part of the story. But in the last 50 years or so, historians have also been pointing out how nationalism plays a big role. The fact that each country believes that they are better than every other country, right? It's why people were so quick to jump on board of the war. The war was extremely popular at the very beginning because everyone thought that it was going to be a short war. They thought that their military was so much better than everyone else's that it was going to be really short, right? And that nationalism, we can see it play out at the beginning of World War I, how it can have very negative consequences. And yet it's also really powerful, right? Like, people were volunteering, men were volunteering to die for their country. And countries are not real things in that they're ideas, right? Countries are ideas, but they're really powerful ideas, right? That drive people to volunteer, to be willing to die for them. Now, obviously, there was a draft in all of the militaries involved. So it was more than just volunteers, but there were people volunteering to fight for their countries. Another key element, though, that historians have been highlighting is militarism. The fact that the Western European powers had been building militaries for decades by the time World War I breaks out. At first, those militaries and the buildup of their militaries was, the excuse was to control their empires. When you control such large chunks of land, a military is needed in order to quiet opposition, to put down revolutions and revolts within the territories, right? So it's important to remember that the Europeans were controlling so much of the world by force, right? That people were not just allowing the Europeans to colonize their communities. They were doing it by force. But eventually, the militaries got larger than they needed to be. The European powers had militaries that were oversized, even beyond explaining keeping control of their empires. And what some historians argue is that you don't build a military just to have it sit around doing nothing. right? If you're building military, if you're developing military technology, eventually you're going to find a way to use it or create a way to use it. So some historians believe that some kind of global war was eventually going to happen given how much money was being spent on building these European militaries, right? So lots of causes here beyond the initial like trigger cause of the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Immediately, one of the things that the Europeans began doing is attacking each other and calling each other barbaric. They're saying you are behaving in ways that are beyond the human. You're not behaving like a human being. What you're doing is barbaric. Right. So this poster is an American poster. It came out in 1917. Who is being described as a barbarian in this particular poster? What is the message you see in this particular poster? Oh, it was the US government telling the public. They're offering an explanation. The poster really is offering an explanation for why for American involvement in World War I, right? Because if you remember, for a majority of the war, the U.S. was pretending to be neutral because most of the American population didn't want to engage in this conflict. But what do you see? What's happening in this poster? What's there? Nothing? Somebody's got to be putting it in the chat at least. Okay, let me see if I can ask a different question. Who's the barbarian in this poster? Was it the Americans? No. Is it the French? The British? The Russians? The Ottoman Empire? Who are the barbarians in this poster?
I think it's British.
Not quite. Not quite. I'm like, that might be actually, that might be a good the good guess. It's the Germans. It's the Germans. You would know, or at least people in 1917 would have automatically read this as the Germans. We don't read it as the Germans, maybe, but the hat. You would have to be into like military history to know this now, but most people would have immediately identified the pointy hat as the German military hat. And then so okay, so let's say that these are the people would know at the time to read this as the Germans. Are the Germans really nice people in this poster? No, right? They're being described here as like a primate, right? That's where the barbaric element, part of where the barbaric element comes in. They're also being described, I think most of you would agree, is as bloodthirsty, violent animals. All right, bloodthirsty, you can see blood, the red in the hands and in the club here. That the red is supposed to be blood. And look at the mouth and the eyes, right? That the bulging reddish eyes, right? The like salivating mouth open, like it's about to eat you. Who's the female figure, do you think, though? This one's open to interpretation, right? She doesn't get a name. Who do you think the pretty white woman, well, naked, half naked white woman is? She could be the US. Yeah, Fatima. She could be the US. Most countries, when they depict themselves in propaganda posters, they tend to depict themselves as female. And to depict the enemy as like some sort of brutal animal-like figure. It was really interesting, some of these propaganda posters. But also you might interpret it as the US because down here it says America. right? So if the Germans are supposed to be bloodthirsty and a threat to America, if you're an American man, what are you supposed to do in order to stop the bloodthirsty Germans? Enlist. Look at the bottom. It says, yes, Kelly, enlist, right? This is meant to get people to enlist by depicting the Germans as these barbaric, bloodthirsty animals. Well, the Germans, this was, by the way, a common accusation. The Russians, the French, and the British all accused the Germans of being bloodthirsty, barbaric animals. Primarily, also the reasoning was the way they marched through Belgium. There were mass rapes of women in Belgium, and there was total destruction of cities and towns. And so that was the reasoning behind the description of barbarism for the Germans. But the Germans turned around and they accused the Triple Alliance of being barbaric themselves. Said, no, no, no. We're not the barbarians, the Germans said. We're defending ourselves. You, the Russians, you, the British, you, the French, you're the barbaric ones. And the reasoning they gave was because they're using soldiers from the colonies. They said, you're the one who is training and arming Black and brown men, bringing them to Europe to fight in a European war. You're training these men to kill white men. And this is a major taboo, right? In the colonies, men were not allowed to arm themselves to fight, to kill a white man in a colony controlled by a European power was one of the ultimate crimes. You would die for that crime. But during World War I, these men are not just trained and recruited and told to kill white Germans, but they're being told to do this in the name of freedom. So the Germans used that to accuse the Triple Alliance of being a barbarian. And the image I'm showing you is a poster, it's a French poster used by the French government to try to recruit men from their colonies. Right? So, you know, it's a French poster because of the flag back here, the blue, white, and red is the French flag. And then the words say 3 colors, 1 flag, 1 empire. And then they have 3 male figures in the middle. Right? This first figure here on the left is supposed to be a North African man. It's to symbolize the North African colonies that were controlled by the French. The figure in the center as a Black man is supposed to represent the Western African and Sub-Saharan French colonies. Again, a lot of territory there controlled by France. And then the Asian man on the right-hand side is supposed to represent the Southeast Asian men, the colonies that France controlled in Southeast Asia. So if you were a man in one of these colonies, one of these French colonies, what message are you receiving when you're reading, when you see this poster? What's the message you're supposed to get from this poster if you're a man in one of the French colonies? Is the message stay out of the war? No, I'll say it's patriotism. Yeah, it's again to that nationalism, but it's really interesting because it seems extremely hypocritical to us, right? How is the French government trying to recruit men that don't have freedom in their own countries? Right? In countries of the French control, they're trying to recruit volunteers to fight in the French military to protect France. That was the message. Come help fight for freedom and to protect France. If you're a man in one of these colonies, is this poster gonna help you volunteer to fight in the French military? Is it gonna convince you? No, is anyone convinced? Jose asked the question most of these men asked was like, wait a minute, I'm not going to do it out of patriotism or nationalism for France. You guys are the enemy. You guys are not our friends. But they did ask, what do we get in exchange for volunteering? What is I say? But let's be honest, nobody was a saint in those days. No excuse for what happened. But it's ironic that every country points at each other like they did horrible. Oh, absolutely. That's the point, by the way. Like the Germans weren't saints, like they did their behavior was terrible. And the behavior of the Germans, I mean, the French, the British, and the Russians and the Americans is also terrible. And the Ottoman Empire, right? Can't forget the Ottomans in the story of World War One. There is plenty to blame to go around. And that's why a lot of soldiers bonded, right? This is the time during World War One was when in the middle of no man's land, in the middle of the trenches, right? In one of the early years of the war, the Germans and the French had a ceasefire, and they all like got in the middle, got drunk together, and celebrated Christmas together. During the war, people fighting on all sides believed that it wasn't the fault of the others, the people on the other side. They blamed the politicians for this war. Yeah, so plenty of blame to go around. But yeah, the colonial men were not going to do it out of patriotism for any of these countries. They did it for a handful of reasons. They were promised pensions. They were promised that even if they died during the war, that their families would get their pensions, their military pensions. If you're a poor man in a French colony, that might be incentive enough. If your family is barely surviving, if you're living in extreme poverty, which a lot of families in colonies were, then that money might be incentive enough to volunteer to fight in the French military. The men who fought in the French army were also promised French citizenship. And again, that if you were going to live in a colony and they were offering citizenship, that might be incentive enough. Like, hey, as long as these people control our land, as long as they control our country, I want at least some rights, some say in this. Right? Even if today it's still an incentive. Yeah, the U.S. promises that anyone who joins the American military is eligible for American citizenship. And we have a lot of undocumented servicemen and women who volunteer for the military because, in part, because of that promise of citizenship, which can make a huge impact in people's lives. Yeah. Now, it might not surprise you to know that the French pretty much, they didn't keep their word about most of these things. A lot of the veterans of World War I from the colonies were denied their pensions and were denied citizenship after the war. So what I'm pointing out here, though, I'm using the French as an example because these men do fight in the French military pretty honorably as well. A lot of them received decorations and awards for their service, but they experienced a lot of racism while serving in the French military. Oftentimes, they were seen as disposable. So they would, when there would be an attack launched, they would be at the front of the line. And if you were at the front, you were more likely to die. And they would purposely put the colonial troops in those positions. Right. At the same time, and here's some rundown of the numbers for the French. 8 million men from the colonies served in the French military. They came from North Africa, from West Africa, from Indochina or modern day Vietnam, Madagascar. They came from the Caribbean. They came from all of the French colonies. The British did the same thing. They recruited, especially from India. There was actually a lot of backlash because they were the first to use colonial troops, the British, from India, and there was initially backlash to their use. But as the war went on, it became clear that it was going to be a long war. People had less to object to in terms of who they were recruiting. Now, in the US, there was also a problem of racism. And the same kind of hypocritical attitude is used in the US to recruit African-American men. It did not go unnoticed for the African-American soldiers that they were being told that they were going abroad. They were being sent across the ocean to fight a war about freedom, right? That's the idea that got sold to American soldiers, that you're fighting for freedom. We're going to go liberate Europe. Well, for the African-American soldiers, it was straightforward hypocritical because they did not feel like they were free in the US. Right? A lot of these soldiers were living in the Jim Crow South with extreme segregation, where they were not allowed to vote and where they had extremely limited rights. So for these men, these men recognized the hypocrisy in being told they were fighting for freedom while not having freedom at home. Right? Same thing during World War II. I mean, the American military wasn't even fully desegregated until the World War II. Jackie Robinson, who if you might know if you know your baseball history, Jackie Robinson tried to he applied for officer training school at the start of World War II, and he was denied only because he was Black. Only because he was Black. So there was still a lot of segregation during the World Wars and a lot of racism experienced by the African-American soldiers. Yeah, Sebastian has making a great point. Many of these African-American men weren't given much credit during the war as white men would get. In fact, after the wars, it was actually dangerous for African-American men to wear their military uniforms out and about in the South. If you're wearing your uniform, because the uniform was seen as a sign of prestige, right? It's prestigious to be a veteran, to have served your country. And in the South, to see a Black man in a uniform was seen as a huge taboo, a huge transgression. And a lot of World War I and World War II veterans would actually not wear their uniforms while in the South because they were more likely to be attacked when wearing their uniforms. And there were men lynched, veterans of World War I and World War II lynched in the South while wearing their military uniforms. So it highlights the extreme racism that exists in this country. And so this was an important part of the African-American experience in the military during the World Wars. However, during World War I, it actually happened during both World Wars, African-American men had a very different experience when they served in France. They went to, they arrived in France, and their descriptions of being in France is of not experiencing racism. They were celebrated. Parades were thrown in their honor. French women were throwing themselves at the African-American soldiers. Right? I have in the slide two quotes from the first one's from an African-American World War I soldier. He said, These French people don't bother with no color line business. They treat us so good that the only time I ever know I'm colored is when I look in the glass. W.E.B. Du Bois in The Crisis wrote, "Vive la France, mine eyes have seen, and they were filled with tears. Men of Africa, how fine a thing to be a Black Frenchman in 1919. Imagine such a celebration in America." In fact, French military authorities were shocked at the segregation and discrimination that they saw in the American army. They were shocked. Now, what is happening here? What are the African American men experiencing in France? Does their experience tell us, is this evidence that the French were not racist?
No, actually, that was the evidence that French was using them to win the war.
Yeah, this is why I made sure to talk about the colonial troops first. The French were not. I mean, there's still significant problems of racism in France. Yeah, Sebastian added something. I think, I'm not sure if it was public or not, but many African Americans would rather stay in Europe than in the U.S. Yeah, a lot of African American soldiers tried to stay in Europe. It's actually why you have a lot of expats, a lot of Americans in Europe in between the world wars. It wasn't just writers and poets and painters. It was just a lot of African American men who end up choosing to stay in Europe because they thought, I mean, they were getting a very different treatment in Europe than they had been in the US. A lot of them also married French women and brought them back to the US. It's interestingly enough, a lot of those marriages ended in divorce. I don't know exactly what that tells us, but it's an interesting fact. But yeah, the French, it's not that the French were not racist. The French were absolutely racist because at the same time that they were celebrating African-American men, they were discriminating against the men from the colonies, right? The colonial troops were experiencing a lot of discrimination in the French military. It's the American thing that was being celebrated. Right? It had taken a lot of effort to get the Americans into the war on the French side, on the French and British side. Right? At this point, the Russians were out of the war. The Russian Revolution had already occurred. And so the Russians were out of the war, and the British and the French needed help. They were basically at a stalemate until the Americans joined the war effort and give the British and the French the upper hand. Right. In that sense, then the French were extremely happy to see any and all Americans. Right. So yeah, I think it would be appropriate to say they were using them. Right. They wanted American military involvement. Right. So it's not a lack of racism. It's just that experience of, hey, we're valuing you for your Americanness. And it's a really interesting thing because I've experienced that in France. One of the times I went, I was doing research and I was staying in a town called Angers in the western part of France. And I was staying with a woman and I was renting a room from her. And she was so excited to have me there. And she was extremely helpful, but she took me to all of her neighbors. She took me on a walk of the neighborhood. And she introduced me to all of her friends in the neighborhood, and she introduced me to them all as her American friend. And I was so shocked at first. I didn't understand because I have never in my life been introduced as an American, except when I've been in France. Well, actually, in Mexico, there's also a bit of a different attitude towards those of us that live in the U.S., Mexicans that live in the U.S. But in France was the first time that I experienced being called an American. I was not a Mexican American. I was not Mexican. I was American. And I'm like, it was so shocked at first. And a lot of it nowadays, right, in more recent times, a lot of it depends what the French think of our president in American politics. right? Because I also remember traveling to Europe during the Bush presidency, and Bush was not very popular in Europe. So whenever Americans traveled in Europe, they would joke around that they would pretend to be Canadian so that they wouldn't get asked. As oftentimes when American travelers abroad were traveling abroad during the Bush presidency, they were asked to explain Bush and explain American politics during the time. Because of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Americans were not very popular at the time. When I went, I also went during the Obama presidency. Obama was very popular in Europe. And so Americans tended to have a more positive experience traveling abroad during those years. I didn't travel to Europe during the Trump or now during the Biden presidencies, but I bet you some of you have had maybe similar experiences traveling abroad. And I can say that this is normal. Yeah.
I don't recommend you going out of the United States right now. I mean, if you go out, people are gonna ask you, "Is your president still sleeping, or is he awake? Is he still taking medication? I mean, is he still alive?"
That's okay, that's interesting. But that speaks to the point, Fatima, that you're making. That's a lot of this is normal. Of course, you get treated in the way people react to the politics of your country, right? And that happens for any nationality, for people all over the world when they're traveling. You become representatives of whatever the president and their policies are, whether you like it or not, whether you voted for that person or not, you become the representative of it. Yeah. And that explains the treatment of these African-American troops in Europe during the World Wars. They're celebrated because they are trying to keep the Americans as happy as possible. In that sense, then, their Blackness does not matter. It's their Americanness that matters. But I was saying, in my country, that happened too. I don't know how I feel about it. I heard about it from some friends sometimes. Yeah, absolutely. Right. I'm like, interesting enough for me too. I have never felt more Mexican than when I was in France as well. But because in two of my trips to France, I was there during the World Cup. And I happened to be out and about in days in which Mexico played in the World Cup. And so to see during the World Cup, right, regardless of what team's playing, the fans of the team are out when the team plays. And so I have never also seen as many Mexicans outside of Mexico in Southern California than I did when I was in Paris on the day that Mexico played. Mexican flags everywhere. It made me really happy because it wasn't not just Mexican flags everywhere, but it was like Mexican soccer fans everywhere. And they were on good behavior that day. So it's just an interesting experience when you start traveling abroad. Okay, I'm going to stop here, pause the recording. We'll come back to World War II.